is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. So shine on. And every time you hit the wall, remember you can have it all, even the mighty fall. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins, yeah. There's no holding back, no overthinking. You've been reaching all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. This is your moment. You got to give it all that you got. Don't hesitate and don't ever stop. You've spent a lifetime waiting for this day. This is your moment. Now's not the time for you to hold back. Don't overthink, it's time to react. The moment has come, don't let it slip away, away, away. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins. You've tamed the voices in your head. You've put your courage to the test. Laid all your doubts to rest. Your mind is clearer than before. Your heart is full and wanting more. Your future's at the door. Give it all you got. No hesitating. You've been waiting all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. So shine on. And every time you hit the wall, remember you can have it all, even the mighty fall. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins, yeah. There's no holding back, no overthinking. You've been reaching all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Samanthropolitics. We have an amazing guest coming up, as usual, Ambassador Cindy Courville, who is the first U.S. ambassador to the African Union, which is a pretty historic and incredible position, and also has been a leader at the NSA and a million other government agencies doing national security policy for the United States government. But before that, I just want to dive into a couple things that are on the news today. And why should we care? So first of all, L'chaim, happy Hanukkah. It's the second night of Hanukkah. And so in honor of Hanukkah, I wanted to take a look at Anthony Blinken, who's going to be our new Secretary of State in the Biden administration. The reason I want to look at Anthony Blinken is because his policy priorities have very much been influenced by his late stepfather's experience living through the Holocaust. Now, his stepfather was Polish, was in 3 different death camps, including Auschwitz, which is the most notorious one that just, murdered millions of Jews by shoving them into the ovens. And he actually was able to escape, not the camp, but he escaped on the infamous death marches that happened when the Allies were closing in and the Nazis said, let's take the Jews with us. We got to get rid of the evidence or get them somewhere else. And then he was rescued by American GIs. So this is really important. And as a Jew, and I'm wearing my mazel necklace that I made. It says mazel, which means mazel tov means good luck. As a Jew, one thing that we are really primed to think about all the time is the Holocaust, and about how so many countries turned their backs on the Jews, how there's like a story of a boat of like little kids that came to the US and were turned away and they ended up all being murdered. There's a million stories of countries that didn't want to take the Jews during the Holocaust, didn't see it as their national priority to take the Jews, even though the Jews were being murdered en masse by Hitler. So what does this do to you from a policy perspective? It makes you care more about people that are being murdered over the shores. Because the whole argument in the US during the Holocaust was that it wasn't in our national security interest. And even when we actually engaged in World War II as a country, there was a ton of criticism because one of the things that we could have done as a country is we could have bombed the train tracks to Auschwitz and to some of the other death camps. And that would have essentially stopped the transport of these busloads of Jews that were being killed until the very last moment. But we didn't do it because it wasn't part of our national strategy and national interests. And really, our involvement in World War II had nothing to do with the Jews. It had to do with Pearl Harbor. It had to do with the enemy attacking on our shores. So we've seen how caring about kind of people who are being murdered abroad has really influenced Anthony Blinken in terms of his foreign policy. So he was advocating for a more of an interventionist approach in Syria, where Assad has been murdering en masse his own people. Interestingly, that's an issue that I also became very interested in as a Jew for the exact same reasons, because I said to myself, with the Holocaust, we're taught never again, never again, never again. And we know that our own relatives were turned away at borders to different countries and probably massacred. Like my entire family that remained in Europe is gone. They're all dead. They were all murdered by the Nazis. And so there's this, awareness of you cannot just say, oh, these people are getting murdered somewhere else. It's not our problem. Don't care. So he advocated for more of an interventionist policy in Syria, which was really interesting. And if you think about poison gas in Syria, like some similarities in terms of the use of gas on the Jews. And no, Syria, it's not putting people in ovens and burning them in mass, but the use of poison gas was this red line in the Obama administration where Lincoln thought that we should do more, and we didn't. And he still feels, crappy about that. He also is he's really about the transatlantic alliance and working with allies and within international treaties and organizations. Now, this is obviously in stark contrast to an America First policy. Let's pull out of every agreement that we've ever had with any other country because Obama did it, or whatever the, America First, isolationism, we don't care, and really sees those international treaties and organizations. So I think in a Blinken foreign policy, we're going to see a lot more of working together with our allies, rejoining those multilateral treaties, reestablishing them. So I don't know. I'm excited to see what happens at the State Department. But I think that this priority on diplomacy, on engaging with others, is really, really critical when we're in a world where we have so many complex problems that require multilateral solutions. And they require different countries coming together in order to solve a problem. One country can't solve COVID alone. One country can't solve climate change alone. These are broad issues that affect all of us. And so we absolutely have to work together if we're going to get a solution. So I just wanted to give a brief kind of, allusion to that, because I think it, on Hanukkah, kind of emphasizes Jewish values, which is not to turn your eye to those who are suffering, and the never agains of the Holocaust, and to care about people, even if they're not like you. So with that, happy Hanukkah to those who are celebrating. Have some dreidels and latkes for me. So a couple other things that have been happening in terms of, since we know this is a show about global politics and women's rights, for the first time in American history, women will hold more than 30% of seats in state legislatures next year. This is according to the Center for American Women in Politics. I always kind of take a deep breath and sigh at this, because these numbers just inch up by 1% every year. So it's is it going to take another 20 years to get to parity? How long is it going to take for these things to get to parity? Same thing with our Congress on a national level. So great that there's historic record, but it's there's just this, it's too freaking slow. This stuff is just too slow. Joe Biden has also chosen Ambassador Susan Rice, who was actually thought of to be Biden's top pick for Secretary of State, which is a foreign policy position, instead as director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. So interesting that he actually picked someone who was seen to be as a top contender in the Secretary of State position for a domestic position, which doesn't require Senate confirmation. Another interesting thing that happens, with regards to women, it's a little windy out here, not my usual studio space. Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, blocked legislation to create a Smithsonian Museum in DC for Latinos and one for women, saying that it would deeply divide our nation even more. This is just idiotic. I mean, the African American Museum is regarded as one of the best museums in the country, and it's because it's able to dive so deeply into African American history. And for those of you who've been or haven't been, it's amazing. I mean, it starts with slavery. It's experiential. It goes to African-American singers and sports teams and athletes. And it just covers so much of the African-American span. And so in order to dive deep on the culture of a population across generations, you have to have a museum dedicated just to that. You can't just be oh, great, let's insert a sentence about Amelia Earhart in the National Museum of American History. Let's throw in something about a Native American. Let's throw in something about a Latino. That's the problem with our history in general and how history is taught, is that we don't dive deeply into the histories of these other communities. And then this white male history that has just been taught forever, which mostly focuses on wars and battles and generals, is the de facto history. We just get those one lines. That's why we need museums dedicated to this, because a lot of this stuff hasn't even been explored. So, Mike Lee, not a fan, not gonna lie, not a fan. And your argument sucks. Another interesting thing that just came out was a study that looked at, so one of the things that's been talked about is that women win elections as much as men do, but that they don't run as often. So kind of the onus is kind of put on women, oh, well, you don't run as much. And so there's all these organizations, and we've interviewed Susanna Welford of Running Start, who are helping embolden women to run for office. And those organizations are super, super, super important. But a new study that came out also just shows that voter bias is actually a main reason why women don't run as often as men in the first place. It's because when I tell my mom I want to run for Congress, she says, Samantha, do you really want to run for Congress? You got to have a really thick skin. People are going to say horrible things about you. I've never taken a naked photo in my life because I'm terrified it would end up all over the internet. And then I would have to resign like Katie Hill. Which, would that have happened if there were naked photos of a man? Seriously doubt it. I think what it shows is that You know, you can't just have bottom up solutions of, oh, we're going to make women feel more confident to run for office. You also have to look at the bias in the systems that are pressing them not to run. And then it's also saying that the reason that women actually win as much as men is because it's a self-selected group of women that are more qualified and probably have a thicker skin that then run for office. So we need to work on voter bias. And even in this election, we talked about how a lot of white women still voted for Trump. We thought there was going to be this huge gender shift away from Trump after all of the things that he's done, you know, to mitigate and take away from women's rights. And there actually wasn't as much as a shift as we thought would be from white women. So there's still an extreme amount of voter bias. So that was my little intro, and I'm super excited to bring in our prestigious, accomplished guest today. Ambassador Courville and I actually met in the National Security Leaders for Biden group. I was not an important policy person. I was helping with the communications team. But she is really an incredible thinker, brilliant strategist. So let me tell you a little bit about her before I bring her into the stream. So she's a trusted strategic policy advisor with over 30 years of experience in national security, international affairs, conflict management, international conflict resolution, policy, education, negotiation, mediation, and gender integration. As the first U.S. ambassador to the AU, the African Union, Ambassador Courville strengthened U.S. policy positions. She also developed international strategic public and private partnerships and prioritized U.S. resource allocation efforts. She's really looked at as a huge expert on Africa and somebody that's really shaped the U.S.'s positions towards Africa. As a former special assistant and senior director to the president at the National Security Council, she is widely credited with developing strategic U.S. partnerships, facilitating alliances, negotiations, and communications in Africa. During her career, which has been amazing, she also served as the chair of the Department of Geostrategic Studies at the National Intelligence University, director for East African Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, senior intelligence officer in the Office of the Chief of Staff at the DIA, deputy assistant defense intelligence officer for policy at DIA. I can't even keep going because there's just so many. A million positions in this in the DIA. She also holds a PhD and a master's degree from the Courville School of International Studies. I actually didn't know that Courville was Madeleine Albright's father, so that was an interesting fact I learned from her, and an MA. And she was an assistant professor at Occidental and Harvard, and then she was basically poached into government service. And so we'll tell you a little bit about that story. She's currently the CEO of Courville Consultants, and I'm sure you'll see her within the next Biden administration. So without further ado, Ambassador Courville, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi there, Samantha. Thank you for having me. Before I get credit for Harvard, Hanover College.
Oh my gosh.
Harvard
Assistant Professor of Occidental College and Hanover College. Hanover, excuse me.
I have guest lectured there, but that is okay. I didn't want to get false credit for Harvard.
That's right, because at Harvard only the TAs are teaching, so it's actually.
oh my goodness, Samantha, you're going to get us both in trouble.
No, I'm kidding. Harvard is wonderful.
Me on. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you. So just because we started talking about, well, actually, let's start with how you got into government service, because I love this story and what it talks about in terms of allyship. So if you could dive into that, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. I was teaching at Occidental College, and it was my 7th year there. We had a guest lecturer from the Army War College, Colonel Dan Hink, who also had his PhD in anthropology and focused on Africa. So he guest lectured, my students were enthralled, and he talked about opportunities for them to work in DC. And after the lecture, I said, what about me? You know, because if you don't speak up, no one knows. And it so happened that my final year at Occidental College, I didn't get tenure. And so you say, well, oh my God, were you devastated? Well, I was disappointed. It would have been nice to have gotten tenure, and I would still be in Southern California, and life could be nice there too. But it was that window open. And sometimes failure is not a bad thing. It's hurtful, but it can open doors too. So had I not spoken up, I would have not wound up a year and a half later in Washington, D.C. at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Colonel Hink took my resume. The man knew me for 3 days. We had a great conversation. His parents were missionaries and then Zaire, then now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And he walked it into the Defense Intelligence Agency, gave it to the colonel who headed the Africa unit. Man interviewed me over the phone. And a year and a half later, after a background check, I walked into being the first African-American woman to come in with a PhD. And this is unfortunately, the late 90s, like 97, 98. So that's not a good thing, but, it opened doors. The transition was interesting because the same research work and all the skills I learned as an academic in graduate school that I used in teaching were all transferable skills. And I think that's important to note. You mentioned Ambassador Susan Rice going from international relations to domestic. Well, the same analytical skills she had in those areas are transferable to her new position. I started off in state and local government and transitioned to international relations, so I can identify.
I think it's really important to identify that. Sorry, I was screaming child in the background, but everyone is used to that now with Zoom calls. There's always a screaming child or a barking dog. I think it's really important to say that, failure can really open doors, and it's not even essentially failure. It's just that different doors opened up to you. My professor from Fletcher, who has been a huge mentor, Kimberly Tyden, was denied tenure at Harvard. And it was largely rumored to be because she was outspoken on behalf of victims of sexual assault. Okay. And she ended up at Fletcher as a tenured professor and at a graduate school, and is, an amazing resource for the graduate students there that are studying international relations. So you just never know what's going to happen. And I think also highlights really the importance of male allyship. How this guy went out, Dan Hicks went out on a limb for you and was like, I'm going to go. This woman is brilliant. She needs to be here. I'm going to do what it takes to get her in this place.
He really did. And even during my first year, because he was still in the military at that time, and I was making, a cultural shift from academia to the intelligence community, he still remained a mentor. I could pick up the phone and said, hey, I'm not clear on this. And he'd walk me through it. So I have had some wonderful men and women who really lifted me up.
It's incredible. So let's talk, I talked about Anthony Blinken to start the show. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on Anthony Blinken and how he's going to approach U.S. foreign policy.
Okay. I think that President-elect Biden made a great choice because State Department has, during the Trump administration, been gutted. Literally, so many people have walked out the door who didn't need to retire at this time. And some of the younger people just left too because they didn't see a future. So from that perspective, I think that his choice is great because he has that institutional knowledge. We talk about the building as if it were a living entity in Washington, but the building needs a Blinken to come in and reassure that the values of diplomacy are fundamentally important, to reassure to the external community, our allies, that the door is open, the dialogue is there. So I think he brings so many wonderful things, especially the transatlantic relationships that are critical, but also working with the African Union. There's a potential for civil war right now in Ethiopia, and no one is watching, no one at home in the State Department. So I know Blinken must be very, very concerned that once he gets in, immediately attention to an ally in the region who we can't afford to lose, and we can't afford to have a regional conflict.
We just have a quick question from one of our viewers. Well, did Ambassador Cindy teach at Harvard? No, it was Hanover. That was my reading wrong. But they still want to know what were you teaching when you were teaching undergrad?
Okay, I was teaching international relations broadly, introduction to politics, race, class, and gender. I did a focus on that as well. Looked at U.S. foreign policy in Africa. When you're at a small liberal arts school in a small department,
You teach everything.
You teach everything. At
You're like
College,
home ec. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, literally the UN course. And I took students for 2 weeks to New York, and we slept in the Y.
I love it.
I was right there with them. Well, we made a trade-off. We slept at the Y so we could go to Broadway shows, go to the UN, really have an opportunity to do so many different things. And Hanover College, 1,000 students, wonderful students. Occidental College, a little bit bigger, 2,000. But again, that opportunity and the race, class, and gender was taught by the film professor, myself in the political science department, the English professor. So you gave that cross-cultural intellectual look at race, class, and gender. So, I mean, I think those are the primary courses I taught. And of course, at the National Intelligence University, I did national security studies, and of course had the opportunity to use both unclassified and classified information in teaching the courses.
Interesting. I would like to, I thought about doing a show on the Ethiopia conflict because I just think nobody's talking about it, and I usually focus on global issues that no one's talking about. So since I'm not doing a full show on it, I actually would love if you could break down for the audience what's going on in Ethiopia and why it's on the brink of civil war.
Okay, just as I said, an overview. We have a split. Ethiopia is divided in terms of its states along ethnic lines, and that was a decision made at the end of the Civil War when Mengistu was governing the country many, many years ago. So part of the problem, the ruling party prior to Abet's coming into being was primarily Tigrayan. And we now have a vie for power. His position as prime minister, he isn't part of the dominant group. And so each group now is looking for their share of power. My concern is that civil war is a real possibility. And he doesn't have full control, at least from the outside looking in, of the military. So I think you could see a real shift in things. If Ethiopia falls apart into civil war, it has a huge impact on Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, the whole region, Sudan, Djibouti. Ethiopia has for the last 20 years or more been a very good ally with the United States. And so it has one of, if not the largest military on the continent. This is an issue. Also, we have the issue not just internally, but we have the issue over the damming of the Nile. Egypt has always said if the Nile were dammed, they were willing to go to war. So there are several two key variables in play right now: the dam and the potential for civil war and destabilization of the region. Either one would destabilize the region. So that's just a short overview. So it is serious, and there's been no attention. So I hope at some point that you do a more in-depth look at Ethiopia, and Blinken, that's going to be on his radar right away.
Right.
Also for, SecDef designate Austin, because Africa Command has the primary, interest in the region. The U.S. also has a base, a temporary base there in Djibouti. Temporary for quite some time now, but nonetheless, they're in Djibouti.
So one of the things that you did, and I do want to talk about the SecDef pick, but so talking with Ambassador Courville, she worked with Liberians and the Nigerians to get Charles Taylor to The Hague, where he was indicted on counts including conscripting child soldiers, ordering amputations, and other mutilations of civilian, and illegally dealing in diamonds, which were called blood diamonds. Naomi Taylor was actually called to testify. Naomi, famous Thank you. Naomi Campbell was asked to testify because he gave her a stone. That was interesting. He served until as Liberia's president from 97 until 2003. And he was really widely held responsible for the country's devastating civil war during the 90s and for the crimes committed during the civil war in Sierra Leone. Also, I found this an interesting fun fact. He went to college at Bentley in Massachusetts and got an economics degree. So how does somebody who gets an econ degree at Bentley go and like be responsible for the mutilation and conscripting of child soldiers? Like, it's a little, it makes me wonder about like what we're teaching kids in college and like whether we should get rid of the math and science requirements and instead teach them about humanity and like not amputating people's legs. I don't know.
I don't think you can blame the professors and the college for that turn. That's a bit much. That would be the same case for the Courville school because the foreign minister of Iran was a graduate of the Courville school.
That's so wild.
So all I can say is that these intellectually bright individuals, there's something that turns them in the other direction. And perhaps the scariest part is that they are so intellectually bright and savvy that they do understand what they're doing. They do note the changes and choices. And, for Charles Taylor, and I'll say it was all about power. And for most of the individuals, whether you go back and you talked about the Holocaust with Hitler, it's about power and amassing power and a disregard for human life. So if I look at Charles Taylor and Hitler, it's clear about the total disregard for human life, all at the expense of acquiring power. And those who back those individuals are willing to do whatever it takes to be part of that system, part of that core group of holders of power. Look, exploitation is not required in order to amass power and a sharing of power. You also talked about earlier, the regard for human life and never letting it happen again. That requires human beings, individuals, groups to really value life. The question is whether or not we should really call entities that exist human beings if they can't value what it means to be a human being. So in both cases, not on the scale of the Holocaust, but we look at the genocide in Rwanda it doesn't know a race or an ethnicity when it's about amassing power. And so in all three of those situations, you can see the similar patterns. The same case with Syria. In order for Assad to amass power, he wanted to eliminate the threat.
It was also educated in I think, the US, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about, I think that's a really interesting insight because so many people spend their lives trying to figure out why do people do horrible things. And yeah, it's that centralization of power, very insightful. So, when you talk about that you worked with the Liberians and Nigerians to get Charles Taylor to The Hague, what did you do? What exactly does that mean?
Okay, in this particular case, I was at the National Security Council. I was the president's special assistant for Africa, responsible for sub-Saharan Africa. You engage with first the ambassadors in DC. That's the voice of a president. If a president or prime minister allows the ambassador to have that kind of role to play. The next it would be working closely with State Department, the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, the Secretary of State. But it's about relationships. And the President Bush 43 at the time was very focused on Liberia. Of course, his father had also been focused on Liberia. That meant that we engaged directly with, at that time, as Charles Taylor was removed from power, the National Security Advisor for Nigeria at that time, General Mohammed, was very close to the National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, in the White House. I was the point person at the NSC. So the dialogues were ongoing about what do you do with this individual? Charles Taylor had been, after the election that led to the transfer of power peacefully, because the Nigerian government, President Obasanjo, stepped in. Charles Taylor agreed to leave, or he was not given a whole lot of choices, to have safe haven in Nigeria, which was pretty much a custom in West Africa, very unique to West Africa. If a leader was moving against his people, for the most part, you would see Nigerian presidents fly into the country, have a conversation, and say either step down or we'll, and to put it in rough language, we'll take you down. So Charles Taylor was then allowed to come into Nigeria. That allowed for President Sirleaf to assume office, but still not comfortably, because Charles Taylor still wielded power, even though he wasn't sitting in the country. And because of all of the atrocities that you mentioned, The Hague wanted him, you know, to be brought before the court. Most of the African leaders weren't comfortable with it, because it meant they would have to give up a president to be tried. It also sets a precedent that they could be tried and given up to The Hague. What tipped that balance was when President Obasanjo was coming to the United States to meet with President Bush. Charles Taylor was concerned that President Obasanjo was going to give him up.
Interesting.
So before, so President Obasanjo was on a plane flying to the US, and the news broke that Charles Taylor was heading for the border. Going into Mali.
Wow.
Was the direction he was going. So, by the time President Obasanjo's plane landed, all hell was breaking loose, both in Nigeria and in the US. Should the meeting happen or not happen between these two heads of states? And, fortunately, President Bush and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, all agreed. Very critical for that meeting to continue to take place. Sometimes you can have a good meeting, sometimes not a good meeting. The conversation was going to happen even before Charles Taylor left. Like, are you willing to, without going into too much detail. So that was the longest, I will tell you, 8 hours, because after they landed, or 12 hours, because there was meeting as soon as they hit the ground with the national security advisors to discuss what are our options, what can we do. The Nigerians had been embarrassed by what Charles Taylor did. My assessment was that even if President Obasanjo had an intent to turn him over, at that point, Charles Taylor opened the door to be turned over, because you don't embarrass another head of state who gave you safe haven in his country.
I'd love your personal opinions, and we talked about amassing power, but I'd love your personal opinions on interacting with, I'm assuming you interacted. Did you interact with Charles Taylor at all?
No, I unfortunately did not have that pleasure. I say fortunately did not. That would have been a hard one. And, I have interacted with others knowing some of the atrocities they've done. And that's hard.
Yeah. How do you do that? How do you deal with somebody that was responsible for conscripting child soldiers or murdering people, and you're like having a conversation with them?
It's difficult. Okay. It's not about you personally. You represent the United States of America. And Blinken knows that all too well. And the people that he has had to deal with are Susan Rice as well, or Linda Thomas Greenfield. You take a breath, you know what your mission is, you know what you need to accomplish. And it isn't that you are, by meeting with them, giving them gravitas. No, look, it's a negotiation. You will have to have the horrible conversations with people who in your ordinary life you would have never sat down at a table and had dinner with. So Fortunately, Charles Taylor was one of those that I did not have to have that conversation with. But behind the scenes, working with the Nigerian National Security Advisor, President Sirleaf herself, I actually did get to work with a very difficult position because her life was in danger at all times, even though she had been elected and made that choice, and also educated in the United States as well and worked at the World Bank and the IMF. But the decision was that, yes, they knew the atrocities. The Nigerians met with President Bush that next morning. Actually, before they met with him, about 4 o'clock in the morning, I got the phone call. The Nigerians caught him before he crossed the border.
That's
and
wild.
brought him back. I will tell you that it was one of the best phone calls in the world because that changed the whole tone of how that meeting was going to go. Had he not been captured, it would have been a polite meeting, but a rough meeting. Because I think there are those on the outside who would have said that President Obasanjo had let him go, which was not on the radar at all. As I said, the difficulty for another head of state, do I give up someone this way? It's tough. It would be the same thing in our own country. Would we give up one of our presidents if an atrocity had been committed in another country?
So you actually led to my next question, which was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf.
Yes.
Who, is she Liberia's first female president?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Africa's first female president.
Really? Africa's first female president.
Yes.
Which is pretty remarkable. Can you, it's so interesting. Like, she was elected and then she was exiled and then she was kind of threatened. What's your opinions on her as a leader and also like her evolution? Like, how did that whole trajectory of winning but then like not being allowed to take power affect how she leads now, or does it?
Well, it was interesting too because she, had gone off and worked outside of the country. That economic background is also in play, understanding the resources, the sheer poverty of the country, and then the atrocities, being, also detained and imprisoned by Taylor in her own country, and then having left and come outside, and the courage it takes to go back into a war-torn country. That's an enormous amount of courage, I should say, and principle to want to go back and feel that you could lead your people. That's not something the average person sees in their future or has any desire to do. Most of us want to take care of our families, have a nice income, have a good life. But the decision to be a leader, whether a good leader or a bad leader, whether a dictator or a Democrat, that takes a sense of self to go in. And she had that kind of courage. Her life was always under threat. And being a woman does not guarantee that you will be the best, the most democratic, the most open. It was a hard thing for her to walk into that country. I've only been to Liberia once. And when you see the sheer amount of poverty, the devastation, the long history of that kind of devastation, and the history of the United States with Liberia, created by former enslaved people. So there's also a connection for the U.S. In that sense. She has been a role model, and we've seen other leaders come since.
What do you think? Yeah, that's helpful. What do you think her biggest accomplishments have been, like her since taking office?
I think it was dealing with the debt issues in her country, moving forward on education. I think she made strides. Again, remember, conditions are, really bad. So a dent in doing that, getting some debt relief most certainly was fundamentally important. Being able to work with the International Monetary Fund, because she had those expertise and those relationships, and also with the World Bank. So I think she set a tone for it. So much to rebuild. I mean, that's why I said it takes courage to walk into a situation where you know you don't have the resources to really do what you need to do to begin with, and to make the conscious decisions which things you're going to prioritize. And for her, economics and education were her priorities.
So I love that segue, which is, what do you prioritize first? So as the first ambassador to the AU, the African Union, how in the heck did you have a clue what to do with this kind of new confederate of countries that were all of a sudden a union, but kind of, I don't know, it's wild.
Well, it daunting and exciting all at the same time. And when we were just talking one-on-one, I gave you a little bit of background in terms of I hadn't expected to be sitting in that chair. Again, honor and a privilege. And so when I was asked, you can't say no, but it was like, oh my God, no was the first thing that came out of my mouth before I realized it, to National Security Advisor Steve Hadley. And so he said, go see Secretary Rice. And I did. And we had a lovely conversation. And I said, yes. I mean, an honor and a privilege. So how do you do it? Fortunately, having worked at the National Security Council, I had interacted with, I would say, a good 40 or so of those heads of states when they either came to visit President Bush or prepared for how we would engage with them, or to be with them in different summits at the UN. So in that sense, I knew what the priorities of the US were. And then how would we engage? I knew what their priorities were. So when I walked in the door, I was a known entity.
What were their priorities?
Knew who I was.
Ambassador Courville, what were their priorities? When you say you knew what their priorities were, what were their priorities?
Their priorities primarily at the time, well, one, they were thrilled because no other country outside of the AU, except for Ethiopia itself, which hosts the African Union, had a dedicated ambassador to the African Union.
So it gave them a sense of legitimacy and this is a real deal. This is a real thing.
Oh, it was a lift. While I was at the NSC, and I'll come back to what you said, what were their priorities? The United States was the first country to recognize the African Union. And to this day, we are the only non-member state to have a dedicated ambassador. The EU has an ambassador, but the UK doesn't have an ambassador. France doesn't. So those are the two. Every other country's ambassador who's posted in Ethiopia serves dual-hatted to the AU. The US was, had an ambassador to Ethiopia and an ambassador to the African Union. So that was a huge lift. What was their priorities? Their priorities were in terms of peacekeeping, and our relationships that way, in terms of economic engagement with the broader umbrella organization, and most certainly on issues of humanitarian, women's rights. Those were some of the core issues that they were focused on, that we also focused on. I had just been on the ground for a month, and Ethiopia intervened into Somalia. So suddenly I didn't have a choice on what I was focusing on. That had to be one of my top 5 priorities. The US had given quite a bit of resources also for Darfur. So making sure that with the 2 military liaisons I had, we had a direct line in support, not only in terms of personnel embedded in the African Union, which was really huge for them to do. But those were the kinds of things in the first 2 years. And standing up a mission, there was no embassy, there was no staff. So the first few months, it was myself, my office manager. I lived in a hotel for the first 4 months until accommodations. I moved 3 times. So my successors had a beautiful house to move into. There was a new embassy for that, and I had secured the spaces. I know people are saying, why is that important? Well, you know, you go from a staff of 3 to a staff of 20 is huge.
Yeah,
I was
absolutely.
out of cycle when I came into the position, so there was no money, not much money there. So my counterpart, Ambassador Yamamoto, was so supportive. I couldn't have had a better partner, and that's key. So we tag teamed on everything. But from a U.S. perspective, it was one establishing and giving a person who the ambassadors and their heads of state knew would have an ear back to Washington, both at State Department and at the White House. So this is how you position. So when Sec State, you know, designate Blinken is thinking now, who do I place where and in what country? There are only a handful of political ambassadors, and I happen to be a political appointee, which was interesting. While I was at the NSC, I still belonged to the Defense Intelligence Agency. So in Washington speak, I was a detailee, a by name request by the administration. I would say, for lack of a better word, in normal times prior to this administration, 70 to 80% of the staff as directors, not as the senior directors or special assistants, come from the federal agencies, because you want people with the expertise who know how to run things. And then you bring in your senior political people as the special assistant. So it was an honor in both cases, because when I first worked at the NSC as a director, I was what we call a GG13. I was not a senior executive, but I was brought in for my expertise. When I left and was brought back to serve as the senior representative and special assistant, you know, I was a GG15. I was not an SES, Senior Executive Service. But again, expertise. And you could see that both in all previous administrations, this was the normal pattern of how work is done. The Central Intelligence Agency always has people. That's part of their detailed assignment, is to spend some time and work at the White House and the National Security Council. When it's used well, it is the best instrument any president can have. Most of the positions at NSC have gone unfilled during the Trump administration.
Shocking. So what do you think? Oh, we do have a question from the chat. They want to know if you're a part of the Biden administration. Well, I'll just say the Biden administration has not taken over yet, but I'm assuming you've not been given a position yet, but what would be your dream position in this administration?
Oh, you know, if asked, I will serve. Most certainly, I was part of the campaign process, and like everybody else, I was on the phone calling voters and doing what I needed to do, and whatever assistance I could give, you know, because it was time. I could not see not being engaged. And after working in government for so long, it was the first time I could be openly out there. Because what we call the Hatch Act, if you're in government, you can't openly go out.
Yeah, even though Mike Pompeo was openly advocating for Trump at his campaign rallies, which was
that was such a violation.
What?
Such a violation.
What?
You know. What? So I'll tell you a Washington secret. You need to wait to be asked.
So this is a great question. Great segue. Michelle Flournoy. So for the viewers that are watching, President-elect Biden has now just picked General Lloyd Austin as his pick for Secretary of Defense. Now, the point of having a Secretary of Defense, it's supposed to be a civilian position to ensure civilian control of the military. This is the third time that a president has asked for a waiver for somebody that was formerly in the military, because 7 years are supposed to elapse between the time when they served in the military to when they are at DOD, I guess, to have more of a perspective or more of a civilian understanding of the military cost ramifications. So the cool thing about General Lloyd Austin, he's the first African-American Secretary of Defense in the US ever, which is amazing. But the person who was rumored to be getting the position for a really long time, and like all the circles I was in, and I'm sure that you were in, it was very much rumored to be Michelle Flournoy. Now, Michelle Flournoy, her background, she was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration and the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. And she also co-founded a really big defense policy think tank that's very widely respected called the Center for a New American Security. She also was seen as Hillary Clinton's pick for defense secretary in 2016, had Hillary Clinton won.
Yes.
So I'll tell you, I am conflicted. I think it's great to have the first African-American SecDef ever, like way needed. But at the same time, Flournoy, as a woman, would have been the first woman Secretary of Defense. And she had a wide reputation for being a brilliant thinker. And she's also a Democrat. Like she's not super progressive by any means, but she's still a Democrat. So I'm wondering you have both identities. You're an African-American, and you're also a woman. So I'm wondering, and your knowledge of national security, your opinion on why Biden went with that pick and what you think of that pick.
Okay. Well, first of all, Michelle is a brilliant woman, talented, enormous amount of experience, and greatly respected. And so is the general. Again, talented, greatly respected. I think one has to allow yourself to get into the president's head, elect's head. And you're right. I can't take off either suit. I'm both a woman and an African American. And someday I will get to be just an American in my lifetime. But no one knows other than the president. So I'm going to respect his choice. He said for the Times, and our military is also in a bit of disarray among the lower ranks, because President Trump has really undermined the credibility. And it isn't to say that Michelle couldn't do that. So you're right. This is the third time we've put a military leader up. Picking who serves in your office in the cabinet is all about relationships. And General Austin had served as head of Central Command, the Middle East, Iraq. Those two men had built a relationship over time. I'm assuming that is the primary reason, based on what President-elect Biden has said. I do believe in civilian control of the military. And, the waiver, I think for the key indicators on the ground right now of what's taking place in the Middle East, I think because he was in uniform and commanded across so many different levels and has experience in the policy world, I think right now, when I've talked about the building at State Department, the Pentagon, which I worked into, the building is hurting right now. And to have someone who has had a foot in both worlds right now may be what is needed for the time, both for civilians and military. And I think we have to be really careful with the royal we, of pitting race against gender.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
And so, as an African-American woman, there were times when, I'm old enough to have grown up where the civil rights movement only talked about the men, and those women were active and up front. So, sexism reigns across all lines. It's a hard call. At the end of the day, a president has to know who he or she wants to talk to, and hopefully someday we get to she. And I'm going to try and have some solace and balance in that the vice president is a woman, and that's a higher office than the Secretary of Defense.
True
So
that.
if I have to make
Absolutely.
some trade-offs and rationalize and look at a logical perspective, the woman holds the second highest position in our entire government.
Mm.
And so I think we go with that. I think because of General Austin, and I don't know him personally, I just know of his reputation, I think we are in very good hands. I think he will bring that calmness to the military side that is needed to restore faith in for the generals who are still in the building and the admirals who got used like puppets. Even General Mathis, who his reasons for serving as SecDef and got the waiver couldn't last but 2 years and had to go
I
because
know.
it
I
was
know.
frustrating.
I
So
know.
I hope that this is the last exception for some time. And we don't know if the general will serve for 2 years, 4 years. So people usually don't stay in these positions the whole time. So, the opportunity may present itself. I think that Michelle carried herself with dignity and grace. And Washington rumors of who's going to be in are dangerous.
Mm.
Dangerous in
Yep.
the sense because no one, unless you were in that room with the both Harris and Biden, you
Right.
don't know what the dynamics were. And I
Yeah.
have a feeling that Biden knew who his cabinet would be long before even the election was over, because you don't wait. You think about who you would tap.
Right.
You look at the situations on the ground. And even with Ambassador Susan Rice, again, Secretary of State would have been fabulous. I would have to say with a Republican-controlled Senate, she would not likely have been confirmed, in my opinion. No matter how brilliant, and she is brilliant. I used to brief her when she was Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and when she had the position I had at the NSC. So, it's a difficult getting through a confirmation, which was one reason I said no, because I never wanted to be that exposed. As bad enough, Intel has its own challenges where you lose who you are or no privacy. But to go before the Senate means the whole world gets to tear you apart.
Interesting. And that goes back to my show opening of talking about this study about women. Maybe they don't want to run for office because they don't want to get torn apart. And so it sounds like the Senate confirmation hearing is just another, you're basically kind of naked and vulnerable on stage, and you can be equipped with as much information as you can, but.
Absolutely. When I went up for my hearing, it was an hour-and-a-half hearing. There were 4 of us, because they usually bring you up in batches when you're just ambassadors, not when you're, for a cabinet position. And my 3 colleagues had about 20 minutes, and the rest of it was spent on me, because I was coming from the White House. So it was perceived that I was close to the president. So therefore, the entire attention was on me. So for about an hour, it was then Senator, I think, Feingold. And he was wonderful, but people said, because it was like the conversation was between the 2 of us. And I got confirmed, so that's the good news. But it is a grueling amount of time. And so I hope that Michelle Flournoy will remain a major voice on national security and international relations. I'm sure she will. I am optimistic that, maybe not at this point, but at some other point in time, whether it's with this administration or the next. And when we have our first woman president, maybe we'll also have our first woman Secretary of Defense. But I would not second guess Biden at all.
Yeah, I guess it's not a second guess, just
easy
thinking
to look
about
from the outside looking in.
I
But
guess
when I look at it, he made
right,
the
it
choice
makes
that he
sense.
needed.
I think so many things you're making sense. I guess, I mean, one of the things that they've said is that when you have like a general that's in charge, that it's harder to push back on things like cutting the military budget. And like, I don't know, I mean, you were an ambassador.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
You don't think so?
Civilians, it doesn't matter whether it's a general or a civilian. DOD's budget is the biggest budget. DOD has an enormous amount of influence. The culture of the military and its mission is so different than state. You know, when you're in the room at these national security meetings, whether it's at, you know, the principal level, which is the cabinet level and the president, or the next level, the deputies, and then the third level down would be the level I ran in the interagency. If you don't have DOD on your side, it is tough to move things. And their budget is never cut, because that's the primary thing for national security is your military.
So that leads towards one of my last questions as we're closing on this hour is, what do you think the biggest national security challenges are for the Biden administration?
Right now, I would say Middle East, Iran, Iraq, in that area. I think, and Syria, we do have to deal with Syria. I was so glad you mentioned that earlier, because we abandoned, in my own personal opinion, people, and that is
I
so
agree.
hard.
So sad.
And yes, there are choices to be made, but when we did that, even our own soldiers on the ground couldn't understand why the people we had who had helped us defend. So I think we have to look at Syria. We most certainly have to go back and look at what's taken place in Hong Kong. We abandoned another group of people there too, in my own personal opinion. So that's two segments at least that we have to review. I think we also have to look at our presence in the Asia Pacific, of course, broader. Because China hasn't changed its end goals, and nor has Russia changed its end goals. And that is not to see a prosperous United States, but ultimately their missions have been the same since day one. So I think there would be the biggest issues for us right now. Africa, because of Ethiopia, I have my concerns right now in the Horn of Africa, which also impacts our Middle East policy as well.
Thank you so much. I just want to go back to Africa for 1 second. It's just my own curiosity, and hopefully other people are curious too, but you've done a lead role in negotiations in Sudan. You were a lead analyst in the Angolan War. What have you, wondering like, what if you've learned any kind of like takeaways for like what the causes are of these wars, and how do you get them to end? Like, how do you get warring parties to come to agreement, to step down, to what's the so many questions.
Well, I'll go back to that concept of power and the vie for power. Angolan War lasted 30 years. After they got their independence, from the Portuguese, because it was that vie for power. And they also had the resources, unlike some of these other countries, to finance. They had oil and diamonds to finance war for 30 years. The conversation was, what's the legacy you're leaving your people? What's the legacy, egos are in there too, that you want to have for your reputation. Or even with the transfer of power, when you look at the Sudan, it was about not giving up power, resources, and control. And people are, I'm going to be a little crass, some people believe that those other folks are expendable at the end of the day. And if you're a Democrat, you're going to, or have democratic ideals, then you're going to look at the broader context of what's good for your people. So the diplomacy is, what can you negotiate? What are you willing to give up? And what do you get for that exchange? I know it sounds so simple, but to sit in a room or rooms, it could take months, it could take years. And the dialogue in Angola with the United States had been going on for as long as the war in Angola had been going on. Sometimes you get divine intervention. In this case, in Angola, the opposition leader, and it's a horrible thing to say, was killed. That was the impetus that led to the negotiation tables, because the other people were equally. Jonas Savimbi was killed. The two generals underneath him immediately signaled they were willing to negotiate. So sometimes you don't have control, but how you deal with a situation, the Democratic Republic of Congo, we talk so little about it. It's a huge country, but there are conflicts constantly going on inside those borders. No one controls it, including the current, president. So to answer your question, you look at the key variables. What's the trade-off? What's the power? Who's willing to relinquish how much power? Does the opposition get a certain say or voice? Militarily, is one group capable of actually defeating the other group? That's another reason, wars and conflicts end. The United States has to weigh, because have we backed some despicable characters? Absolutely. At the end of the day, our national security interest has to come first. And that's a hard thing to go to work knowing and doing and say, how can you make it a win-win? And it's a constant discussion and negotiation, because short of going in and taking over someone's country, which is never the option that you want. Secretary Powell said, if you break it, you own it. And that's a horrible position to be in with people's lives. So the more that State Department is on target and you have a really strong diplomatic corps, the less likely you have to use the Department of Defense. The Secretary of Defense never wants to go to war, no matter if that's what they're trained for, because lives are lost. American lives are lost. Other people's lives are lost. DOD is your absolute last resort. Diplomacy, economic diplomacy with, commerce, trade. Those are the tools you want to use. Your healthcare, working on HIV/AIDS. The United States gave $15 billion to deal with a pandemic. That's how you deal with a pandemic. The Obama administration worked on Ebola. Ebola didn't touch us, but a little dent. It didn't come to our shores. That's how you deal with a pandemic. And so I feel that the Biden-Harris administration will deal with the pandemic both home and abroad, because as the world's great superpower, you have a responsibility not only to your own people, but to the world as well.
Yes, thank God. It's like I can't stand when people are like, well, we're not supposed to be the policeman to the world. And it's like we're the world superpower, although I don't know if we are anymore with, after 4 years of Trump. But it's like, no, like you have response, just like we're talking about in the privilege debate. You have a responsibility to use your privilege as a white upper middle class person to help those that are disenfranchised. I think that same kind of, you have a responsibility as a nation with money and power and prestige who people listen to use that on behalf of the less fortunate and less privileged.
We left a vacuum for 4 years. And, I have to tell you, our allies and our enemies have one thing that they remember. There will be another election. This person will go away after 4 years or 8 years. And so they are incredibly generous and kind, and especially our NATO allies, our African Union, our Organization of American States. They were waiting patiently with bated breath at the outcome of an election and saying, okay, they'll come back. And this is what I would say with General Austin, his relationships with NATO, a known entity, a known quantity, and it's taking nothing away from Michelle. But when you can get to the table and you've already talked for years, the conversation will flow quickly. So I'm assuming those were the reasons why Biden-Harris made the choice they did. And Michelle, I'm optimistic we'll have her chance.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador. This has been unbelievably insightful. I know you also wanted to plug the National Security Executive and Professionals Association. Can you explain what that org is exactly?
That is a group of actually African Americans and other minorities who have all served in the national security community at the senior levels, who work together on papers and also who put out op-eds, who advise in many capacities, and also who help to make sure that diversity happens in the national security arena.
I asked Ambassador Abercrombie this, but what is your opinion on Linda Thomas Greenfield, or what does that feel like to have the first
I think she's
woman?
outstanding. Now, this is the second time we've had an African-American woman serve at the UN, because Susan Rice served and was also.
That's right.
So it's interesting that now that we don't think twice about it, but she's there, a seasoned career diplomat. I worked closely with her because she was our choice for ambassador to Liberia. So
interesting.
I was at the NSC, she was at Liberia. So, it was good to be there with her for the inauguration of President Sirleaf, both Condoleezza Rice and Mrs. Bush. And it was an interesting tidbit that happened while we were there. And after the inauguration, someone asked Condoleezza Rice, was she running for president? And Mrs. Bush said, "Run, Condi, run." and Condi looked at her like, no way, I won't do that. So no, that is not Condi's, ambition. But it was kind of funny to hear the first lady.
Oh my goodness.
It was, but I'm saying this, Linda, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield is just an outstanding diplomat. And so she's well known in the diplomatic community, has served in many places. And also she has, in this capacity, her Africa experience will also translate in the UN when 54 votes are present in the UN. The African countries tend to vote in a block.
Interesting.
So that's a lot of leverage when you need a lift in the UN. So, I think we've got some great women who are in key positions, a diverse group of women. There's still some more picks to come, and most certainly Biden's pick for Treasury, I am absolutely elated about. I don't know her, but she is, just as I said, she is outstanding across the board with her expertise.
She's brilliant. She's like ridiculously brilliant.
Yes.
Well, I think that I can join my audience in saying that we hope that you serve in the Biden administration. We hope that you are asked. I know you were not going to go ask, but I hope that you get that opportunity on behalf of the American people, because we would be extremely well served to have you again in that position in government, and in any position in government.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I can feel the warmth from you and your audience. So, and again, thank them for their wonderful questions. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Courville. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Samanthropolitics. I hope you enjoyed. That was Ambassador Cindy Courville, who was the first ever United States ambassador to the African Union when it was first formed. You also heard about her negotiating in like 20 different wars. Really interesting insights on, what causes war, about power, strategic interest, resources, which I think also gives us a lens on how do you stop that, and how do you come to a negotiating table? What's at stake? How do you decide what you're going to give up? Really, really fascinating insight. So I'm super excited that you have joined me for this episode. Let's hope that, from the person in the chat that said, is she a part of the Biden administration? Not yet. Let's hope it's a yet. I would love to see her serve. In other news, join us next week again for another episode of Samanthropolitics. If you liked this show, if you got something out of it, share it with your friends, your colleagues, your Facebook, your Twitch followers. I always say with especially your Fox News watching grandparents or parents. And the people that generally, I think what's important about this show and highlighting the voices of people that have really been in international relations is there's not a huge knowledge of that in the American kind of knowledge base. And so getting this out there, I think, is incredibly important. Hopefully, maybe we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive on Ethiopia in another session. I also want to say, if you're in Georgia, make sure you vote. If you're not in Georgia, the Senate runoff elections are happening. There's a ton at stake. The control of the Senate is at stake and of the entire Congress. So vote. If you're not voting in Georgia, volunteer, make phone calls. You can see that nobody is too prestigious to volunteer. I have seen some pretty prestigious volunteers alongside me making phone calls where I'm like, is that Anne-Marie Slaughter making phone calls with me to voters? Like, oh my God, it is. Like, whoa, like no one's below it. So please step up. Your voice really, really matters. And then also thank you so much to Stream Inspectors and especially Zach for hosting and producing this episode of Samanthropolitics and for making all of the wonderful graphics that you've seen. That's all the work of Stream Inspectors. I am not an artist, just a talk show host. So until next week, I hope you have an amazing week and I will see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.